Hi everybody and happy Canada Day. Today I will be reading chapter 11 of my novel, Living Nightmare, which is the first book of the Other Side of Gifted series. And I'm currently working on book 2. Last week I read chapter 10, where Tobin woke up after having a nightmare of a hit and run to find bruises and marks all over her body. The doctor was concerned and worried about her either injuring herself again or somebody else if she was now having a severe form of sleepwalking. Chapter 11. Why does everyone want me in chains? My parents kept me home, schooled by them to ensure I received a proper education. The nightmares leave me paralyzed, allowed to watch, but not to interfere. Now Dr. Dawson threatens me with restraints. For my own good, he says. When will they let me be free? Tobin. Tobin charged down the hallway, mindless to the patients staring after her. A shiver of alarm raised the hairs on her neck. No way. I won't let them. Restrained to her bed? Was he joking? The idea sent waves of panic to leap in her stomach, eating and scorching her insides. She wouldn't hurt herself. How could he think that? Why would she do such a thing? Didn't he get it? She was sleeping. She had no idea what happened to her. He read her entry. Didn't he notice that her wounds matched the boy's? Couldn't he explain what was happening to her? Wasn't that the reason she was at Mendwell in the first place? She turned a corner sharper than intended and barreled into something. No, someone. She stepped back to regain her balance, reaching out to catch the person and prevent them from falling. Their shoulders were thin, frail. Their gazes met. The woman was in her mid-60s. She looked soft, with wheat-colored hair that flowed loose and wavy to her chin. Her eyes were the color of caramels. Wrinkles bracketed both her eyes and generous mouth. Her gentle hands gripped Tobin's forearms, helping her to steady herself. Tobin felt tall, standing above the 5'1" woman whose build reminded her of a bird. Oh my, that was quite the meeting, she said, smiling. Tobin didn't have a chance to respond before Nurse Tiffany rushed over, scanning them both for signs of injury. Marie, Tobin, are you all right? We're good, aren't we, dear? Marie chuckled. Her eyes hadn't moved from Tobin's, though she spoke to the nurse. She's got wonderful reflexes. I hope you don't mind me wandering about. When you were called away, curiosity got the better of me. Tobin fidgeted. Marie's smile widened before she gave her attention to Tiffany. Of course it's fine, Tiffany said. It's good to learn your way around. I was about to give you a tour, but Nurse Harding needed to speak to me. Actually, it's lucky that Tobin ran into you. I need to talk to her and some of the patients. Great. What now? Tobin eyed the nurse, but her expression gave nothing away. There was a mishap with some of the meds yesterday, Tiffany flushed. She began to twirl a lock of her brown hair, her chocolate eyes locked on Tobin. Apparently while covering for Miss Harding, Nurse Helga ignored her instructions. She mixed up some of the patient's meds. Oh my, Marie put a hand on her chest. Tiffany gave her a weak smile. Yes, it could have been worse, but still. Nurse Harding is not happy. 6 patients were given the wrong pills and doses. She asked us to check in with those patients. Screwing up the medication was not a small mistake. Helga was probably about to walk out of the building with her belongings in a box, and Tobin wouldn't be sad to see her go. Helga didn't like her much. Marie shook her head. It's a good thing Nurse Harding noticed, right? Tobin. It's Tobin, yes? How rude of me, said Tiffany. Yes, this is Tobin. She's one of our longest residing patients. Tobin Blake. Tobin, I'd like you to meet the new head of nursing. This is Nurse Sheldon. Please, Call me Marie, the woman interjected, taking Tobin's chin in her light grip. This was different. Kind. Marie looked into Tobin's eyes and hissed patiently. You poor dear. You're in pain, aren't you? She released Tobin's chin to dig around in the tote that hung from her shoulder. I have just the thing. My husband's always getting scrapes. I've got an ointment that never fails to heal him nice and fast. Aha! Here it is. She took out a flat silver cylinder container, popping off the lid and holding it out to Tobin. Tobin glanced at the pale pink cream with flecks of green. The smell of flowers and mint filled her nose. I make it myself, Marie said. It's an old home remedy. All natural ingredients. Flower extracts, plants. Nothing to be afraid of, dear. She tilted the container towards Tobin, daring her. Testing her? Tiffany had no problem expressing her enthusiasm. Isn't that something? Homemade too. Well, go on, Tobin. Tobin studied the cream before giving in and scooping up some on her fingers. Marie held up a compact mirror for her to use. She dabbed the cream onto the marks on her face and neck. The mint in the ointment was cooled on her skin. It tingled. She couldn't deny that the cream eased some of her discomfort. Thank you, Nurse Sheldon, Tobin said. Please call me Marie. She snapped the lid on the cream. Take it, dear. You'll need to apply it once a day, she said, looking Tobin over as she held out the little jar. Make sure to use it on all injuries. Tobin blinked at her in surprise. I couldn't. Marie took Tobin's hand in hers and placed the container on her palm, closing her fingers around it. Of course you can. She patted Tobin's hand before letting go. Tobin gazed at her hand. When was the last time someone had given her a present? Marie turned to Tiffany. You said something about a tour. They left, Tobin staring after them, at a loss for how she should feel. Marie was certainly unexpected. She seemed to generally care. How long would that last? Tobin tightened her hand around the container. Would Marie avoid her like most of the nurses, or would she be constantly hovering around like Tiffany? Tobin sighed and headed to her room to store the cream. Tiffany hadn't taken it from her, so she assumed it was safe to keep. Ange found her in her room hours later. There you are! Her red hair was still wavy from having been in braids the day before. One sleeve of her shirt and one leg of her pants were pushed up on opposite sides. Tobin decided she wasn't even going to ask. Guess where I went today? Ange sat on the striped bed across from Tobin's. You'll never guess. The zoo, she beamed at Tobin, her smile turning into a horrified gasp a second later. She hurried over to sit beside Tobin. Oh my goodness, your face! What happened? Who was it? Tommy? Tobin opened her mouth to answer, but Ange wasn't done. Her eyes narrowed. I told you he was trouble. Got an attitude, wrapped in a temper, waiting to explode. I can't believe he hurt you. Wait until I get my hands on him. She lifted her hands into fists like a fighter's stance and punched the air. Was it wrong that Tobin wanted to laugh at the sight of the bubbly 22-year-old trying to look threatening? She bit her lip to prevent her laughter from spilling over. It was sweet. Ange wanted to defend her. She waited for Ange to take a breath and said, It wasn't Tommy. Ange peered at her. What happened then? Don't know. It was like this when I woke up. Nothing just happens, silly. Something causes it. You sure it wasn't Tommy? Tobin nodded and settled back against her pillow, bringing her knees toward her chest. Positive. Tommy avoids me, remember? Because of Kyle warning him I'm evil. Anne shoved Tobin over to sit beside her. She stretched her legs out, wiggling her feet. Tobin stared. She wasn't wearing any slippers or socks. Pfft, Kyle. He was a wackadoodle. More like a pathological liar. Kyle had stayed on the 4th floor ward for 6 months before becoming an outpatient. He left a year ago, but made sure to spread as many ridiculous stories as he could about Tobin first. One being that she was a witch. He's an ass, she said. Ange's eyes grew wide at her use of profanity. Then she let out a giggle. She turned to study Tobin, her face serious. If not Tommy, and you don't know, she paused. Maybe your powers are increasing. You're getting stronger. Or, Tobin rolled her eyes, getting the wrong medication, screwed with my dreams, and I hurt myself. It sounded more plausible than Ange's theory, and she'd have to mention the possibility to Dr. Dawson. Wrong meds? You know how Nurse Harding wasn't in yesterday? Ange nodded. Tobin went on to explain about Nurse Helga's inability to follow instructions. Oh, Ange pouted. She wanted to be right, wanted to believe in secret powers. Tobin wished she could. She could understand the appeal, but she always preferred the truth over lies and dreams. It was time for a subject change. You said something about a zoo, Tobin prompted. The question had Ange wiggling in excitement. She happily told Tobin about her animal adventure with her uncle and Madame Lacombe. Tobin was enthralled. She'd never been to the zoo. Her parents claimed that animals should be studied in their natural habitat, or it wasn't worth the time. The idea that the zoo was intended for entertainment would have baffled them. Tobin paid close attention to everything Ange shared, from the food she'd eaten to the animals she'd seen, and pretended that she had been there. She had a strong imagination, much to her parents' chagrin, and it disappointed them whenever they caught her daydreaming. Well, tough, she thought. They weren't around, and her mind was her own. If she wanted to pretend she saw penguins and monkeys, then that's what she'd do. The cafeteria was alive with the buzzing of patients and the smell of burnt food. Tobin saw Ange standing at the end of the food line and joined her, grabbing an orange plastic tray. She was given a slice of soggy and indistinguishable gray meat, and something they claimed was mashed potatoes, and a pile of frozen mixed vegetables. Yum. She chose a carton of apple juice over the 2% milk, Ange's choice of beverage, and followed her friend to the empty table. What do you think this is, Aunt? Tobin asked, poking the meat with a fork. Chicken or pork? She hoped those were the only two options. Let's see. Ange cut a small piece and popped it in her mouth. Tobin watched her face as she chewed. Ange scrunched her nose. Chicken? That didn't spark a lot of confidence. Tobin decided she'd stick to the vegetables and bit into a crinkle-cut carrot. The last thing she wanted was food poisoning. Ange wasn't so worried. She continued to eat the pale-colored meat. Had her years of Mendel's cafeteria food ruined her taste buds? To the point where she thought the food was good? Tobin frowned. Not chicken. It's... Ange stopped. Her eyes filmed over as she stared at something behind Tobin, mouth open. Tobin knew that expression. She'd seen it countless times whenever Ange had locked on to someone she believed had special powers. Who's she? Ange asked, her tone oddly subdued. Tobin turned to see where she was looking. Her eyes landed on a familiar face, and she shrugged. Marie Sheldon, she said. She started today. She's the new head of nursing. Marie was standing by the entrance and chatting to Nurse Jill, but glanced to where they sat. Her eyes met Tobin's and she smiled. Joe made her look tiny in comparison. His arms were crossed, bulging biceps on display under the sleeves of his white shirt. Weird. Tobin turned back to Ange. What is? Huh? Oh, nothing. Ange forked to pee. Since when did Ange not go on a 5-minute monologue? Tobin looked around for Marie, but she was gone. Joe jerked his head at her questioningly. Not wanting him to come over, she returned to her food. If anything was weird here, it was Ange. After dinner, Ange dragged Tobin to her room, explaining that she needed help making a decision. Her uncle wanted to have his guest room redecorated for her, and had asked her for her input on colors for paint, bedding, and furniture. Pretty generous of him, Tobin thought. Obviously, money was not a problem. Ange was overjoyed at the idea of picking out what she wanted. The problem was, she didn't know what that was. Ange liked everything. It would be her special place, so she wanted it to be perfect. Tobin to the rescue. Ange grabbed a flip book of paint colors her uncle left her to borrow, and the two of them made their way to the common room, where they sat at one of the tables. A cartoon movie was playing in the background. A princess was singing something about doors opening for the first time in forever. They spent 10 minutes discussing the advantages of pastels versus bold shades. Or rather, Ange did. Tobin randomly voiced an opinion. Her parents leaned towards neutral colors for their house, like browns and beiges. They were working on pairing colors, finding what Ange called accent colors, when someone began yelling at the table beside them. Mikey Martin, the OCD patient, banged his fists on the table. "Puzzle doesn't work," he shouted, shoving the partially completed puzzle across the table and knocking down the tower of cards Lacey had been building. Lacey gasped and jumped out of her seat. The room got quiet. Lacey's gaze fell on Tobin. Tobin flinched and looked away. Mikey cursed. Tobin twisted in his seat just in time to see his face turn a deep red, spittle flying from his mouth as he stood, grabbed his chair, and threw it across the room. The chair hit the shelf, and 4 books fell to the ground with a loud smack. "Mikey, my man, what's wrong?" Joe was calm as he crossed the room, nudging patients out of his way. As he rounded Tobin's tail, he held his hands out to show that he was harmless. Too bad Mikey Martin didn't get the message. He kept cursing and flipped the table, which crashed to the floor. Tobin and Ange had to move quickly to avoid getting hurt. Tobin leapt in front of Ange, using her body as a shield in case he threw anything else. Ange grabbed her by the arm. She was shaking. Tobin placed her hand over Ange's and looked around. Lacey was huddled with the other patients by the sofa, watching the scene, out of harm's way. 2 guards ran in the room to assist Joe. Nurse Patricia, who was also supervising, began urging patients to go to their rooms or to the cafeteria. Nurse Chris entered and helped usher patients out of the area. Glad to see this, Tobin returned her focus to Mikey. Joe and the guards were trying to corner the patient. Joe in front. He was talking to Mikey in soothing tones, but the patient was far too gone in his rage. Tobin glanced at the guards on either side of Joe. One was a couple inches shorter than Joe, out of shape and a decade older, and the second was no better. He looked no more than 16 years old. There was no way these two could handle a patient in crisis. They shifted closer. She wanted to warn them that cornering Mikey wouldn't work. It would only escalate the situation. She stepped forward and opened her mouth to speak, but before she got the words out, a sudden movement from her right had her breath swooshing from her lungs. "Marie, what the hell did you think she was doing?" Unnoticed, Marie maneuvered around the tables. Her face was serene, like she was taking a stroll down a wildflower-covered meadow instead of walking toward a patient deep in a violent fit. Tobin moved to stop her. Ange's nails dug into her arm. She'd forgotten about Ange. "No," Ange whispered. "Just watch." Watch? Was she kidding? Tobin tugged her arm, but Ange wouldn't let her go. Marie stood behind Joe. One of the guards tried to wave her off, looking angry that the old biddy might ruin their plan. She ignored him, just as she did the calls from the other nurses to stay back. Mikey had another chair in his hands, held high above his head. His face was a splotchy mix of red and white, eyes wild as they darted around the room. Tobin could practically read what was going on in his head. Panic, fear, confusion. Each of the 3 feelings tried to climb over the others for top position. The chair shook in his grip, his hands unsteady. He was going to throw it at someone, probably whoever tried to get close to him, and it looked like that was going to be Aunt Marie. "Stand back, ma'am." Joe tried to keep Marie back as she edged around him. She brushed his hand off her shoulder. "Let us handle it," said the older guard. "We don't want anyone getting hurt now." Marie gave him a sweet smile and took another step forward. She was less than 2 feet from the raging patient. Tobin couldn't watch. Mikey Martin wasn't a bad guy in normal circumstances, but fear and rage could twist a person up. Add in the panic from the men who were trying to cage him. Marie was putting herself in serious danger. Again, Tobin tried to move forward toward her. Ange added her other hand to Tobin's shoulder, tugging her back. Don't. Tobin cringed as she watched Marie. She didn't want to see the woman get hurt. Marie was nice. Gave her the cream to help heal her cuts. What was she thinking trying to help with Mikey Martin? See? She's good. Ange's words brought Tobin out of her thoughts. Ange let go of her shoulder to point at Marie. Everything in Tobin froze. Mikey still held the chair in his hands, but was no longer trembling. Instead, he stared at Marie. She was talking to him, speaking too softly for Tobin to hear. Marie slowly reached up and cupped his elbows, guiding his arms downward into the chair, was returned to the floor. What? How? Tobin didn't understand. How had she done that? Mikey Martin was seconds from throwing the chair. Whatever Marie said had flipped his switch from crisis to calm. A tear trickled down his face. His eyes focused on the head nurse as she continued to murmur. What was she saying to him? Tobin wasn't alone in her disbelief. Joe studied the pair with confusion. He glanced at Marie. Tobin saw respect and awe in his eyes. The guards had their mouths open. Aside from Tobin and Ange, all patients had been escorted from the room. Nurse Patricia was making her way toward them, but Tobin couldn't tear her eyes from the scene. Marie led Mikey Martin to the upturned table. His shoulders slumped, but with Marie's help, he began clearing up the mess he made. Patricia tapped Tobin on the shoulder. Come, girls, let's give him some space, she said. The table and chairs were returned to their previous positions. The card and puzzle pieces were picked up. Marie sat beside Mikey Martin, and ignoring those around them, they began working the pieces together. Tobin! Patricia's voice was stern. She had called Tobin's name more than once. Tobin gave an absent-minded nod. Ange made a comment about Tobin helping her choose bedroom furniture and slipped her arm around Tobin to drag her off. How did she do it? Calm him so fast. How did Ange know Marie would be fine? Just who exactly was Marie? In bed that night, Tobin lightly traced the marks on her face and neck where the echoes of the boys' wounds had finally faded. She had applied another coat of what she was calling Marie's miracle cream right after supper. By the time she brushed her teeth and used the facilities one last time, the marks were gone. The bags under her eyes and the red vein sclera of her eyes were sadly a part of her everyday appearance. Lack of sleep was not kind. She rolled onto her side. Her muscles were tight with tension. She was scared. Alone, surrounded by darkness, Tobin admitted the truth to herself. She was terrified of falling asleep. She didn't want to dream, didn't want to see any more violence. She wanted the nightmares to stop. There was so little left of her that wasn't chipped, broken, and badly glued back together. How many nightmares would it take to shatter her irrevocably? Why? It was the most daunting question. Why did she have nightmares? Why was her mind obsessed with violence and death? She rolled onto her back again and stared at the ceiling. Shadows crept along its surface, cast there from the slither of moonlight cutting through where the curtains failed to meet in the middle. Were there any stars out? Didn't people wish on shooting stars? Should she go, maybe wish for happy dreams? She snorted. Wishes. She's starting to sound like Ange. Not good. Someone around her needed to be the rational one. Reality might suck, but at least it didn't lie like fantasy did. Wishing for good dreams would do nothing but depress her when they failed to happen. It was smarter to accept the nightmares were in her future. Maybe Dr. Dawson would soon determine what caused them, or at the very least find a way for her to live with them. Those were realistic possibilities. She yawned, then let out a soft curse. Not ready, she thought sullenly, but her eyelids were closing beneath their own weight. Stay awake. She had to stay awake. Just a little bit longer. She really hated sleeping pills. She blinked one more time before her eyes remained closed. Before sleep won. Again. Well, that is the end of chapter 11. We were introduced to a brand new character, Marie, a nurse, who seems to be a little bit something different from everybody else with her ability to calm a patient in crisis. Will Tobin find out what's going on with her? And will Ange see her uncle again? We'll find out more next week in chapter 12. Until then, I hope everyone has an awesome Canada Day and an even better week.